Hey up, campers, Johnny Matthew here. Welcome back to the blog. It's great to have you back. If this is your first time, so you're not back, you're just coming for the first time, welcome. It is lovely to have you here. I really hope you find it useful. If you've been before or you like this one, you can contribute financially. If you want to, you can become a paid subscriber. I'd be very grateful. I think you can do it for a £5 or thereabouts. Think of it as buying me a pint. Although actually, I was in the pub the other day and it was £5.40 for a pint. So it's a bit less than a pint. But of course, you are welcome to the material anyway. So I hope you enjoy this one. This one is called HSB Practice Lessons number 1. HSB meaning harmful sexual behaviour. Practice Lessons number 1, booking the system and avoiding knee jerks. Introduction. I've published a few things in my career so far, not a lot, but a few. There's a list of those on the temporary website, and you can obviously click through if you want to see a publications list from the text blog. But I never really get tired of the buzz for me when something new comes out. And this month, a chapter that I co-wrote with my lovely colleague Sharron Wareham, ex of Bernardo's Better Futures Service, now of the Centre for Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. We published a book chapter in a book called, wait for it, Cultural Responsivity, Book 1, Treatment of Sexual Violence. Yeah, I know. It's not one to leave around on the coffee table. Obviously. But anyway, in that chapter, we lay out 3 detailed case studies of children who've run foul of the law because of their harmful sexual behaviour, or HSB. And Sharron and I use those examples to highlight systemic failings and encourage responsive and sensitive practice, really, that takes full account of childhood and childhood as a developmental work in progress. Anyway, I've been on a roll thinking about and writing about HSB lately, so I thought I'd just bang out a few basic practice ideas that I think can help keep us from making these kind of same mistakes, these systemic failings in our work with kids. There's a button, by the way, also in the text blog over on johnnyvm.substack.com. That's johnnyvm, JONNYVM.substack.com. There's a button there that'll take you through to, it's just an Amazon link to the book if you want to find more information about that. Okay, booking the system. Despite huge progress over the last 25 years or so, working with children and young people who've displayed harmful sexual behaviour, or HSB, still sometimes gets pulled towards risk management, control, and perhaps most of all, sort of adult-like assumptions about intent and psychopathology. I think in a world of, the Epstein, whatever it was, files, and constant use of this term, paedophile, there's an easy mistake to make when harmful sexual behaviour in children comes up to somehow, even tacitly and faintly, associate HSB in kids with that kind of adult-fixated paedophilic stuff, which absolutely isn't. But unfortunately, in the system, there's a lot of that around still, and the kind of iatrogenic harm is still rife. Iatrogenic basically meaning, doing, in our attempts to help, we do harm. And I think when the system labelizes kids with these kind of adult-like assumptions and labels and fears and kind of risk paradigms, then that becomes potentially harmful. All too often, reactions are still knee-jerk in nature. Tabloids still rush to stick children with adult labels, and it's still easier for the common mind, particularly, so the non-professional or non-specialist kind, to assume inherent pathology than it is to pause, look for a bit longer and see the story behind the behaviour in children. Now, of course, most specialist practitioners navigate this work in an appropriately child-friendly way. But the vagaries of wider systems, even safeguarding and youth justice systems sometimes, don't always do so well. And as we've said, knee-jerk reactions, defensive practice, and occasionally assumptions about adult risk patterns can wind things back to the bad old days. And the trouble is that when fear dominates, and we all fear the unknown, don't we? And I guess children and sexual behaviour is such an unknown, and rightly so for most people, it can feel fearful. But when fear dominates, development gets lost. Children are, by definition, developing, so we need to do everything we can to keep HSB, as with every other kind of offending behaviour in kids, firmly in the child-first zone. So, simply put, I guess, our chapter argues for something simpler and more demanding, actually, than the easy tropes and regressive risk ideas. We need to understand sexual behaviour in children through a developmental and trauma-sensitive lens, not a criminal one. That doesn't mean to say there's no place for the criminal system. I haven't got time to go into the nuances of that today. But the lens that we see the child through should not be a criminal one. So what follows here are some practice lessons for anyone working with children and young people where HSB is a concern, or maybe the central issue, whether you're a specialist worker or not. And it'll especially please those who share our passion, that's mine and Sharon's passion, for booking a system that doesn't always serve these kids or the public good very well. My throat is dry as a bone, so I'm going to take a very quick interlude and have a drink and then come back. Okay, HSB Practice Lessons. So I'm going to lay out here the first 4 that came to mind and then complete the list in the next blog next week with 5 more, I think. I've already drafted that one. So, as always, I need to say completely out. These are just me pouring it out onto the keyboard. They're not grouped into clinical categories or meaningful taxonomies at all. These are things off the top of Johnny's head, having been worked with this stuff for a decade or 2 or 3, that I hope will be useful. And as I imagine most people on planet Earth are not going to read a book called Cultural Responsivity, Book 1, Treatment of Sexual Violence, although I shall certainly be reading it, hopefully you might get some benefit from something a little bit more distilled and practice focused. So here we go. There's 4 of these. Number 1, keep in mind that age is not the same as maturity. Chronological age tells us very little about a child's actual capacity, in fact. The baseline maturational process of brain development, particularly the complex stuff around executive functioning, that frontal lobe stuff, doesn't complete until much later than previously thought. I mean, if we can use the term, quotes, brain childhood, unquote, that's now generally considered to continue well into the mid-20s, and some studies say now as late as 28 years old. So maturation, certainly baseline maturational processes of brain development well into the 20s. So children who are by virtue of their age alone are under the age of 18, certainly in legal terms, are nowhere near adulthood in developmental terms. That's why this ridiculous system we've got with these cliff edge, today you can't, tomorrow you can because you turn 18, is such a total nonsense. But it's and particularly kids who tend to engage in HSB, there's other developmental things gone badly awry often. So not only are they not in the mid-20s, so their brains are not anywhere near completion of baseline maturation, they're also delayed even further by the other experiences. So trauma, neglect, abuse, neurodiversity and disrupted education can significantly delay this development further, such that children may possess much less capacity to understand their impulses and control their behaviour than their number of trips around the sun, as my colleague Tricia Skuse calls it, might suggest, in other words, the number of years they've been alive might suggest an awful lot more capacity and functional ability to control impulses and behaviour than is actually there, because age does not equal maturity. Physical appearance often masks emotional, cognitive and moral immaturity. There's a link in the text post on the words moral immaturity there, just as an aside, because the last 2 posts before this one on the blog were about Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development in children. So might be worth a look at that if you're interested. Many 15-year-olds, for example, will look like they're 20. But many of them may be delayed in their development and functioning and actually be at a stage that's more akin to primary school kids. And add to this the biologically turbulent and mesmerizing forces of pubescence, and things get tricky very quickly. And for me, the best thing to do here is to pause, step back, take time to properly scan the long view for this child, manage the risks, of course, always, and then begin the work of encouraging some developmental course corrections to get things back on track. So that's number 1. Keep in mind that age is not the same as maturity. And the practice lesson summary here is: never assume understanding, intent, or responsibility based on age alone. Functional maturity must always be assessed. Current functioning is best seen in light of the child's journey so far, which is why, in my view, life course case formulation really needs to be central to all assessment processes. So that's number 1. Age is not the same as maturity. Number 2, harmful sexual behaviour is often developmentally out of sequence. When children show sexual behaviour that is clearly outside what would be expected for their age, something has usually gone wrong earlier in development. And this is one of the many things that I've learned to assume is happening. Any of you who have sat in training with me will have heard me say over and over, I tend to try and screen everything in until I have a good reason to screen it out. What that does is it saves us, I think, from making quick decisions, assumptions about this case based on past cases, seizing the first symptomatic indicators and rushing to find or say what that means, rather than say, okay, I can see that, what else is there? And assume that these things may be part of the profile until I have a good reason to screen it out. And I would absolutely, in my case, and in doing this work, what I tend to do is I just assume that any child with harmful sexual behaviour has suffered some kind of sexualised history, which is driving that. And because they're children, they shouldn't have any sexualised histories at all. So many children with HSB have learnt about sex too early or in unsafe ways. So, for example, being eroticized early due to long, frequent, severe exposure to pornographic material long before they have anything near the maturational wherewithal to filter and understand it. That's one example, early sexualization. And then another example for it may be that they've grown up being abused sexually, hands-on abuse, or being exposed to somebody else being abused, quite often the mother or girls in the family and other siblings and other kids may witness that, for example, as well as possibly being a first primary contact victim themselves, or in any other kind of way. The kids have grown up with sexual abuse exposure. So the child's concepts of care, relationships, adult behaviour, and their own role in the family can get terribly skewed. So when that stuff spills over into harmful sexual behaviour, we just need to remember that behaviour may reflect copying, confusion, or survival strategies, all of those, rather than sexual intent, setting out to do something sexual, never mind something sexual to harm another person. In my experience, there's nearly always some element of abuse in its widest possible sense. abuse reactivity going on. Why wouldn't there be? If kids are exposed to sexual material, experiences, abuse, violations, and all the rest of it, they're not in the place to understand and assimilate that. They don't have easy access to services to help them process it. So it comes out in behaviour. So when it comes to sexual behaviour that's out of sequence, prepubescent sexual behaviour is particularly significant. We should never dismiss it, or just assume that this child is a potential harm to others. You need to be asking the question, what happened to you? More on that later. It's very presence alone, sexual behaviour that's out of sequence. Never mind the details of the type and the severity and the frequency of it. Its presence alone should be enough to sound the alarm. So that's number 2. Harmful sexual behaviour is often developmentally out of sequence, and the summary of that one is, if behaviour doesn't fit the child's developmental stage, the key question is not what did you do, but what happened to you. And as practitioners, I think we can usefully ask ourselves questions like, why does this HSB make sense for this child? What role does it play for them? What do they get out of it? Where did they learn it in the first instance? And how do they feel about it before, during, and afterwards? And what this will do is get us out of those easy tropes and running out of those kind of habitual practice fire exits, if you like, and save us from confirmation bias and make us pause and look for a little bit longer. There's a lovely quote. There's a quote slide. I always try and put a quote slide in the blog by Anne-Marie McCallendon, who wrote the most fantastic book called Children as Risk. It's quite a meaty, it's part of the Cambridge Criminology Studies series. It's really, really good, and it speaks particularly to HSB and sexual exploitation by children. And it's brilliant. And she says, we need to move away from monochromatic distinctions between victims and perpetrators of abuse, which are ultimately unhelpful as a frame of reference in responding to the risks presented by HSB. So I'm going to take another very quick slurp break and then come back and look at that a bit more closely. That number 3, the victim-perpetrator split, is a false one. 2 minutes. Shout out there for the excellent guitaring by one of my best buds in the whole world, Mr. Liam Millinship, world-class guitarist and all-round excellent chap, who I was privileged to play with in a folk duo called Barlow Cree. All one word, BARLOWCREE. I haven't got time to explain that now, but if you Google it, you can find it. There's a couple of albums out there somewhere. Anyway, here we go. Number 3, Practice Lessons HSB. The victim-perpetrator split is a false one. Now, you guys will be aware, of course, that systems often divide children into 2 camps. The harmed child, seen as vulnerable and deserving of care, and the harming child, seen as risky and responsible. Now, in this latter group, the harming child, it's that group that most often fall foul of these adultifications, I think of them as, and overreactions. Where we even tacitly in our minds, we make assumptions about kids based on how we think and the public thinks and the tabloids think about adult sex offenders, and we need to resist that with everything we've got. Now, I'm with Anne-Marie McCallendon here, the quote we read just now, that this split is a false binary that's deeply misleading at a conceptual level and completely unhelpful at a practice level. And that's what we're all about, right? Doing the practice properly. Even if we were in possession of all the necessary information to determine whether the weight of a child's behaviour places them more in the victim camp or more in the perpetrator camp, what would that achieve? We've just stuck them with another label. It's a tag. But how does that help us? So what matters here, I think, is how this child got to this place, what meaning this has for them and those affected, and what we can usefully do to mitigate all this and move forward. couple of quick bullet points here. Children who cause sexual harm often have their own histories of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Think of it as trauma in the broadest sense. Protecting one child while ignoring the needs of another. In other words, this child's seen as a victim, so we'll protect them. This one is definitely seen more as a perpetrator, so we're not so worried about them. It's really about risk and containment and management. So protecting one and ignoring the needs of the other increases long-term harm. I think it labels the, quote, offending, unquote, child, obviously. And it may actually increase future problems, not least if the child's sense of who they are, that self-concept stuff, begins to form around what they've done. I think we need to stay really clear of that. This is behaviour. It is not a definition of the child. And then lastly, a child can pose risk to others and be at risk from others at the same time. They can do things that are harmful and simultaneously be frightened, unsafe and traumatised. And to split the two is to split the child. We should be working for coherence and a positively unified sense of self, not a clearer label to satisfy some vacuous, utterly useless systemic taxonomy, in my view. I really despise that stuff. So that's number 3 practice lesson. The victim-perpetrator split is a false one. And the summary of that is safeguarding and treatment must include all of the children involved, including those whose behaviour is causing harm, keeping in mind that the reason they're now causing harm is almost certainly fueled by the harm that they themselves have endured at the hands of somebody else. I'm going to say that again, it's a bit garbled. We need to keep in mind that the reason they're now causing harm is almost certainly fueled by the harm they themselves have endured at the hands of others. That's really key. So let's reject this victim-perpetrator split as an unhelpful falsehood. And then fourthly, behaviour has a function. You could put function in inverted commas, I guess, there. Behaviour has a function even when it's harmful. Sexually harmful behaviour in children is rarely about sexual pleasure. Prepubescent kids, absolutely certainly, may well experience, some physical pleasure in bodily contact. But this is manifestly not the same thing as adult sexual sensation because it lacks the maturity of thought. I mean, they don't know the meaning behind that. It lacks context and reciprocity. And a track record of kind of functional adolescent exploration and experimentation and so forth. Now, our problem as adults is that we can struggle to assimilate our own associations of sex and pleasure from abusive behaviour that is sexual. We can't separate the two out. Our stuff about sex and pleasure in sort of normal, functional, consenting, mature, reciprocal relationships, we can't separate that from this horrible abusive stuff that these kids done. So we ask understandable but actually nonsensical questions like, how can they possibly get any pleasure from doing that to someone? Well, it's just the wrong question. A better one, in my view, is to ask where the behaviour might have originated and what function it might have for the child now. If any, but nearly always does, in my experience. So sexual behaviour in kids, particularly those with sexualised histories, which is the majority of one form or another, often serves other purposes. So things like regulating fear, anxiety, distress, and other difficult kind of complex feelings, gaining a sense of mastery, either over the self or their feelings, actually, or over others, usually other kids. It could be about seeking connection, reassurance, or attention, feeling warmth and contact, not being isolated and disconnected in the world. Or it can be just a reenactment of learned and skewed relationship patterns, messed up displays of affection, or, of course, downright abusive behaviours if they've been exposed to those. So these are all things that the behaviour might provide, if we can use that term loosely, for the child. Now, whether we're assessing or treating, having a sense of how the child sees the behaviour, what their expectations of it are and how they've learned it, back to that origin stuff again, is absolutely critical. Personally, I'd always want to ask, what did you think would happen if and when you did this? I'd also ask, how did you think the other person was going to react, or how the other person might feel when you did this? And where do you think you learned this behaviour from? Where did it come from? Where did you first see it? When did you experience it or watch it before? Or these kind of questions that gently, in a kind of validating and empathic, sort of sensitive way, look to. It's Socratic, I suppose. It's that gentle joint exploration of, help me with this. Why might this be? I think that's really useful. And obviously, when and how we ask these questions is based on our understanding of and relationships with the child concerned. And timing is everything. We don't just wade in and ask this stuff. But once you're into a treatment process or an assessment process, I think you can ask these if you kind of know the level of maturity of the child, you get to know them, you're familiar with the sort of words and phrases that they use to describe different relational, social, sexual practices, then we can flip those and ask some nice, gentle questions that can tease some of that stuff out. So that's number 4, behaviour as a function, even when it's harmful. And the practice lesson summary there is, assessment must explore what the behaviour does for the child and where it came from, not just what it does to others and how to stop it. Having a focus on behavioural function, I think, can really help with this. So, quick summary. What good HSB practice with kids look like? Now, across the book chapter, but more so in this post, I've tried to summarise what effective harmful sexual behaviour practice consistently involves. Here's a bullet point distillation, 6 of these. Number 1, being mindful of how systems confuse children and responses to HSB. Yeah, particularly because sexual behaviour makes adult associations in our mind. So be mindful of how systems confuse those things is important. Number 2, take care to avoid unhelpful technology. I think the victim-perpetrator split is unhelpful. Never mind using totally misguided phrases like, mini paedophile or a teenage predator or just this stuff. Completely unhelpful. Number 3, remember, age doesn't equal maturity. Hardly ever does with these kids, unless the sexual abuse or the kind of etiology, the stuff that's driving the HSB, is a kind of one-off event that happened fairly recently, and the kind of attachment and traumagenic stuff is kind of good and not there, respectively. So they've got some attachment security and they haven't suffered massive trauma. If it's fairly recent, discrete, one-off incident that may have triggered this, then usually you find there's other things that have skewed the development and held the maturity back. So just remembering that age doesn't equal maturity. Number 4, maintain a child-first, trauma-sensitive stance in everything. Constantly remind ourselves, this is a child. This is a child who's probably been very delayed in their development, at least in places, and we need to remain very trauma-sensitive, not to trigger things, that iatrogenic stuff, not wanting to do harm in our attempts to help, to do it from a relational stance and have a safeguarding lens for everything. Number 5, push for developmentally sensitive formulation-based assessment. One way to guarantee we don't get distracted by labels is to ask about the life course of this kid. Start with birth. Have a chat with mum. Ask how the pregnancy was. Was it a difficult birth? How did she find it? What was going on for her at the time? These questions can be done gently and sensitively and can be gold dust when people feel at ease and can help us fill in some blanks. So being developmentally sensitive and formulation-based, really key. And then lastly, manage the risk. Don't judge the child. None of this that I'm saying undermines the need to manage risk, but we need to manage risk to this child, not just from this child. Keeping the focus on what happened to them will help us to do that. So don't judge them, but we do need to be managing the risk, of course, particularly when other younger kids are involved. So there we go. That's the 4 practice lessons from this one. I'll just scroll up and read them to you again. Keep in mind that age is not the same as maturity. That's number 1. Number 2, harmful sexual behaviour is often developmentally out of sequence. Number 3, the victim-perpetrator split is a false one. Number 4, behaviour has a function, even when it's harmful. Final thought. Children and young people who display harmful sexual behaviour are not telling us that they're dangerous. They're telling us that their development has been disrupted, needs have gone unmet, and they need our support to sort through it all and begin moving on. If we respond with fear, punishment, and labels, we risk reinforcing the very conditions that shape the behaviour in the first place. For us, we must strive to see the child themselves and, preferably, take the long view of how they came to where they are now. Who influenced that journey? Who disrupted it and how? And where has that left them in terms of relationships, knowledge, readiness to navigate a complex sexual world, particularly as they hit adolescence and that whole physical stuff kicks in too. If we respond with curiosity, compassion and developmental understanding, we can create the conditions for safety, recovery and change. All the time using our relational skills to engage the child with warmth, acceptance, good humour and empathy. Now, none of that is about being soft on harm. It's about being serious about healing now and prevention of risk and recurrence later. So there's 5 more practice lessons coming in the next post. I really hope that was useful today. Thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers, guys.